Odzak was the last battle of the European theater, but as virtually everyone is aware, at least you better know that this happened, the war in the Pacific still waged on. Yet, even after the battles of Iwo Jima and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, little else is generally talked about. Yet, there was indeed a set of battles that has had major consequences and disputes that last into the modern day. What is this campaign, that you may ask? Well, it is August the 18th of 1945, and the Soviet invasion of the Kuril Islands has begun. The Kuril Island chain had been a point of dispute between Russia and Japan since the 1800s. The 1855 Treaty of Shimoda would split the island chain down the middle, giving the upper section to Russia, with the southern sections going to Japan, with the Isle of Sakhalin being under the occupation of neither, and instead monitored by a joint Russo-Japanese force. This was adjusted in 1875, with Japan giving up their claims to Sakhalin, while the Russians gave up the claims to all of the Kurils, with one further revision following the 1904 between the two powers, which saw Japan occupy the southern half of Sakhalin. Even though the two powers were on opposing sides during the Second World War, neither were exactly all that eager to invade one another. The Soviets were busy fighting Germany, and Japan was still suffering from PTSD flashbacks. While this de facto peace would last for the majority of the war, much to the chagrin of alternate historians, the Soviets were pressured into joining the Pacific Theater once the war in Europe was finished. And thus we come to the Manchurian Campaign, and depending on which source you listen to, 700,000 Japanese casualties would come of this 11-day campaign. While the invasion as a whole needs a full video, don't worry, I'm working on it, we're going to be focusing on the smaller invasions that came shortly after the fact. Starting on August the 11th, Soviet forces would march across the border on the island of Sakhalin. Here, the 40,000 strong Soviet 16th Army would face off against the 20,000 strong 88th Division of the Japanese 5th Area Army, as well as 10,000 reservists that were hastily raised in the defense. While the Japanese would have the advantage of over a dozen fortified bunkers and heavy artillery to support their defense, they lacked any air or naval support, giving the Soviets total dominance. Even outnumbered, the Japanese managed to hold off for days, and when the order for general surrender came on the 15th, 5th Army Commander Kuril Islands refused to follow through, and instructed his men to continue fighting to the last man. Initially, fighting was kept to the Kafato fortress defense line, and even outnumbered, the Japanese managed to hold Soviet troops at bay. In order to give some reprieve, elements of the Soviet Pacific Fleet would make landings at the port of Taro, now Shatiyazaku. Marines would storm the city, defeating the 200-strong garrison within said city. From here, they'd breach out, capturing the cities of Iristu, Anbitsu, and Yuranai to minimal resistance. Further south, an assault on the city of Meiko met stiff resistance, resulting in heavy naval bombardment that turned much of the city into ruin, and it was ultimately the last real engagement of the campaign, as virtually all members of the 88th Division would surrender on the 25th, allowing the Soviets to occupy the rest of the land largely unresisted. The invasion of the Kuril Islands would start on August the 19th, once the majority of the campaign in Sakhalin was finished. Originally, men and equipment dedicated to this operation were going to be used for a full-on invasion of the Japanese mainland, with landings on the northern end of Hokkaido, but were cancelled just days before the operation was set into motion. Instead, the bulk of the Soviet forces in the region would shift gears towards the Kuril Islands, fearing that if left unoccupied, the Americans would prevent their annexation. The Soviet forces dedicated to this operation would consist of the 57th and 86th Corps of the 2nd Far Eastern Army, which would number roughly 15,000 men. To supplement these troops were the Kamchatka Defensive Army, made up of roughly 8,000 local reservists on the northern Sakhalin regiments. In addition, 78 aircraft and 60 transport vessels would supply the army with pure naval and air dominance, as their Japanese counterparts lacked both. Speaking of the Japanese, at their disposal was the newly created 5th Army, which numbered roughly 80,000. While vastly outnumbering their Soviet counterparts, the majority of the 5th Army were that of poorly raised reservists, conscripts, and members of the Bourrier, essentially their hastily raised militia home guard. While largely made up of poorly trained troops, they were competently led by Lieutenant General Tatsumi Futsuki and had significant firepower on their side. The first and ultimately decisive battle of the campaign would be at the island of Shimizu. Shimizu had been turned into a virtual fortress by the stationed Japanese, who had long expected potential amphibious invasions of the island. 8,700 strong and backed by sturdy heavy artillery, they managed a surprisingly fierce defense that would halt Soviet advances for 5 days, the only time such an event occurred during the Soviet-Japanese War. Nevertheless, the final forces at Shishumi would surrender on the 23rd of August, leaving the Soviets to occupy the rest of the northernmost islands. While the Japanese would unconditionally surrender on the 19th, large sections of the garrisons on the remaining islands would continue to resist, even though they were vastly outnumbered and lacked support. While no notable battles occurred following Shishumi in this campaign, it would take the Soviets another 2 weeks to fully occupy the rest of the Kurils, suffering 60 casualties from the local guerrilla fighters that threw their lives away to fight for a regime that had doomed itself to failure from the very start.